So I'd like to welcome everybody and thank you for coming along to our session on open textbooks today. For those of you who don't know me, my name's Thomas Palmer, and I work with the digital learning team in the library. And in just a moment, I'll introduce our other wonderful speakers who are going to talk today about some of the benefits associated with designing, creating, and using open textbooks. So as Chris mentioned in the chat, please feel free to introduce yourself in the chat. And if you have any specific questions about open textbooks or anything you'd like to get out of the session today, please feel free to pop that into the chat as well. We will get time for questions at the end, and we're looking forward to sort of seeing your questions. All right. I'm getting ahead of myself already. So before we get started today, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners and their custodianship on the lands of which we're meeting from today, and to pay my respects to their ancestors and their descendants who continue cultural and spiritual connections to country. We recognize their valuable contributions to Australian and global society. All right, so today, as I mentioned, we're really lucky to have some wonderful speakers that really bring a range of diverse perspectives and experiences from around the UQ community. So we have with us today speaking UQ students, we have academic authors of open textbooks, and we also have representatives from the design community as well. So I'll start off today by providing a very quick overview of what open textbooks are, and then I'm going to pass over to our speakers, who I'll introduce now. So firstly, we have Laura Drysdale and Danny Theodoru. So Laura studies criminology and criminal justice at UQ, and Danny studies speech pathology. And together, Laura and Danny are going to describe what they found when they asked UQ students about their experiences with commercial textbooks as part of a student-staff partnership they undertook last year. We're also really lucky to have Dr. Suzanne Bonner and John Ratey here today to explain some of the pedagogical and design decisions that informed Suzanne's book, Social Cost Benefit. Suzanne is a lecturer with the School of Economics, the author of Social Cost Benefit, and John is a learning designer with the same school, and he helped Suzanne as she was developing her book. We've also got Jane Johnston with us today to discuss how her book Public Interest Communication was developed, and also how it's being received by students in the classroom. In addition to publishing Public Interest Communication, Jane is an associate professor with the School of Communication and Arts, and is also the author of several other commercial textbooks. So her experiences are going to be really interesting. I'll finish off by talking a little bit about some funding opportunities and some support that is available to UQ staff who are wishing to create their own open textbooks, and then we'll finish with some questions. And we've also got Chris Frost here with us today. Chris is going to kindly assist with chat, and he's a senior principal learning designer with the Faculty of Humanities and Social Sciences. Okay. Well, let me just start by maybe talking a little bit about what open textbooks are, because I know that not everybody here today may have heard the term open textbook, and they may not be familiar with what an open textbook is. Open textbooks come in all sort of shapes and sizes, but they have a few things in common that are important to kind of, I guess, know about. So firstly, unlike commercial textbooks, open textbooks are designed to be completely free for their end users to access. So, students and academic libraries need to, of course, purchase access to commercial textbooks. That's not the case with open textbooks at all. Another really important point of difference is that open textbooks are licensed differently. So they're typically licensed under an open license and frequently a Creative Commons license. And these licenses are designed to make open textbooks easier for others to use, share, adapt, or remix with proper credit to the original creators and appropriate attribution, of course. Open textbooks are born digital, which is not always the case with commercial textbooks. So that means they're kind of ideally suited to incorporating a range of media, not only text, but images, video, and audio content, as well as a lot of interactive content, such as H5P. And so Suzanne, Jane, and John are going to talk a little bit about some of the H5P activities that they've incorporated into their books. So in Australia, open textbooks are still not as common as they are in other countries, but this is quickly changing. And so many Australian universities are beginning to encourage open textbooks and are even providing sort of grant programs to support their creation. Partially, this has been brought about by our experiences during COVID, where we realized many textbooks were not available electronically for our students to use. And sometimes, even if they were available electronically, there were kind of restrictive access conditions placed on them by publishers, which made them difficult for students to sort of to use. I guess another factor is libraries are always dealing with the rising cost of commercial resources. And so we're dealing with an environment where we have a bit of a constrained budget. So here at UQ, the library offers the Open Textbook at UQ service and also makes available a platform to host open textbooks called Pressbooks. And so what I might do now is I'm going to hand over to Danny and Lara, and they're going to talk a little bit about student experiences with commercial textbooks.
Hi everyone, so I'm Lara, as Thomas mentioned. So in semester 2 of last year, myself, Danny and Prati Rehan engaged in a student staff partnership with the library to gather insight into UQ student experiences with textbooks and what impact open textbooks could have had at UQ. So with the student staff partnership, we completed a literature review to build an understanding of the issues excuse me, around the use of textbooks and to inform the development of a survey. In September of last year, we distributed a survey open to all UQ students, which consisted both of multiple choice and short answer questions. I'll pop a link into the chat, which will take you to a blog page for anyone who would like to know more about the survey. But me and Danny will talk about some of the findings that we had in the survey. So we identified several issues that students currently have with commercial textbooks. Throughout the project, we argued that open textbooks are the key to solving these issues. Thomas, did you just want to flick to the next slide? Yeah. So from the survey, we had 59 responses, which were analysed. Most respondents had been at UQ for 1 to 2 years at the time. Some of the most significant findings from the survey included the fact that 64% of respondents did not purchase a textbook for that semester. And for those that did purchase a textbook, 62% spent between $100 to $200, and only 29% spent less than $100. Also, of the 21 respondents, 8 felt that their textbook was worth the expense, while just over half felt that the textbook was not worth the expense. And 4 respondents were unsure. So I'll pass over to Danny now, who will explain a bit more about the survey results. Thanks, Danny.
Yes, of course. Hello, everybody. So yes, if we move on to the next slide, so you can see currently the library does offer online textbooks that are able to be used. That's a really, wonderful first, it's a wonderful first step from physical textbooks, but currently they do have a few issues. So some of them one of them is that there are limits on how many students can access a book at the same time. And another one is that there are limits on downloading and printing, obviously. With that too, the fact that they are online as well in itself is a bit of a deficit, because you have to consider sometimes there are students who may live sort of in a low reception area. They may not be able to access those textbooks all the time. That, and also there might be somebody like a student in a cafe and the Wi-Fi might be really bad, and so they're not able to access the textbooks. So, I mean, obviously, if that's a consistent thing where a student isn't able to access the textbook because they don't have reception or they don't have internet, that does pose sort of a hindrance to their learning outcomes, and we don't want that for our students. The other thing too, so there is in the box here, you can see that there were 5 things that students thought were most important, what they wanted to see in an online textbook. And so, as was mentioned, one of them was the ability to print or to download, and no access restrictions, obviously. A very important one is the third dot point. They want them to be free. I think that's really important because, students spend a lot of money on their education, and that can be a lot. So spending more on textbooks is something they don't really want to do, obviously. But another thing to consider too is that sometimes students may just not want to spend the money for the textbook because it does cost so much money. And so, obviously some students might be able to just, get their pass and just move on. But, do we really want that? I think it's really important that students, it says in the next slide, actually, don't go there yet, but it says, someone said, why should textbooks be hidden behind a paywall? We don't want that. We want students to have, sort of equal learning opportunities, and to hide the textbook behind a paywall essentially isn't what we want to be doing. And the other thing too is the ability to read on multiple devices. Again, that's really good. Some people might want to read the textbook on their laptop or the tablet or their phone. They may also want just like something to print out to look at. So it's important that sort of we cater to those diverse learning needs, essentially. If we move on to the next slide as well, you can see some more speech bubbles there. So that's some more responses about what people wanted. It says on the slide that 83% of students surveyed, they expressed positive feelings, and the number I think was 46% already frequently use the open textbooks in their courses, which is cool. So it's already something that's sort of coming, but we want to keep on promoting that awareness for them because we say that they're really good. You can see here as well, as I mentioned in the middle, speech bubble said, education should not be hidden behind paywalls. In the third speech bubble, you can see as well with textbooks, obviously, they're helpful for the course, but once the course is finished, you'd find that students don't really use them that much. And so that is a lot of money that they're spending just to be used only for one course. So, that's something to consider as well when to spend so much money on a textbook just for one course. That's sort of a reason why students may not want to spend that money to get that textbook. So if they're free, they'll always have access to it, and they'll be able to access that information in their textbook later on, which is really good. And of course, in the first speech bubble, you can see there's a mention to a specific textbook by Dr. Suzanne Bonner, who is here today with John Wrighty. And I'll pass it on to them so they can discuss. It'll be the social cost benefit analysis and economic evaluation of open textbooks. Thanks, guys.
Good morning, everyone. Can you see the slide? Okay. I think you can see the slide now.
Yep.
All right, thank you. Well, good morning and welcome. Suzanne and I are delighted to be here to share this textbook. And I'll start with our very first conversation Suzanne and I had. And at that time, we loosely sort of knew what the content was going to be in the book. But most importantly, we started with the pedagogy. That was the first decision we had to make, is how do we enhance student learning in this textbook, regardless of what the content is. And so we came up with a bit of a plan. And for example, we started with the learning objectives for each chapter. So the students really knew from the beginning exactly what they were going to learn about and what they were actually going to do in this chapter. And to enhance learning, we also thought about the medium of digital. So we thought about the screen size that, you know, students have in their tablets or iPad or even mobile phones, you know, because they would be perhaps reading the book on the bus on the way to uni. So part of the pedagogy then was to make sure that the content was written in chunks rather than sort of having this long narrative. So they could easily identify areas in the chapter, and it would fit the screen much better, the screen real estate. Included in that, we wanted to make sure there were signposts like feature boxes. The beauty of digital, of course, is that you can link out to all sorts of digital assets. So you can easily embed YouTube videos as an example. And the other great thing about it is that you can represent the content in different ways. And that's really essential if we are talking about universal design for learning, where we can make the content more accessible and inclusive by, say, for example, rather than just having text, having diagrams, having graphs, having animations to represent that content. And then, of course, we made sure that there was a step pedagogy all the way through. So start at the very beginning of the chapter with a basic concept, and then moving on and developing different levels of complexity on top of that. So I'll pass over to Suzanne to talk about active learning, which is another big part of our plan or our pedagogy. And then we'll actually show you some examples from the book of what I've just been speaking about.
Yeah, thanks, John. So one of the big things I thought about is how I could engage my students with their learning throughout the course and throughout their engagement with the materials that I'm providing. So I used a lot of H5P activities. In fact, I made over 200 H5P activities as part of the process of developing this book, so that students could get more effective formative feedback about what they were reading in the online textbook. So for example, I would have a bit of content, like a little chunk of content, and then I'd have a follow-up practice question where they could do a multiple choice question or a drag and drop activity that allows them to evaluate whether they understood the content that they just read. So that gives them immediate feedback and allows them to think about whether they actually learnt the objective that we've outlined for them. So in particular, I found this useful because often if a student has misunderstood and they do the activity, they get it wrong, they can go back and reread the section and then come back to the activity and attempt the same activity again to really solidify their understanding. So I kind of viewed it as a way of encouraging my students to progress through their learning as like a process, right? So it's not just that they're reading the book and they go away to their tutorial and then they discuss maybe an answer to a set of questions. Each time they're reading the book, they're engaging with activities that are going to constantly give them some sort of formative assessment that allows them to understand whether they really understood what they're supposed to be getting from the materials themselves. So I spent a lot of time on those H5P activities. So I think maybe, John, you can maybe demonstrate some of these examples. So here's where we said we started with the learning objectives. I clearly outlined the learning objectives at the start of each chapter. and I chunk out each concept. So I start off, obviously, first week is what is cost benefit analysis. So we give a chunk of information, and then we follow with a little activity to support the learning. And these activities can be repeated as many times as the students want. And as they put anything into the thing, they can check whether they've got it correct and then do it again. Yep. Is there anything you wanted to comment about this section, John?
Yeah, just to say his feature box. So Suzanne obviously had some really key concepts. So the first one was scarcity. So you can do things like that to highlight certain areas. Once again, here's another chunk. Here's another question and answer. You can do all sorts of things with H5P. It's actually a fabulous tool. So for example, here, Suzanne sort of explains something, but here's a different mode of representation. So they can actually go through, and it's basically an animation of sorts to sort of show them how it all works. The rich media I mentioned. So if it's got a Creative Commons license, it's easy to link in. And here's another activity. And then all the way down to, say, the end of the chapter, the revision section has actually got quite a number of the H5P activities. So in a commercial textbook, you know, they don't really get immediate feedback. Here they do. And then what Suzanne would do is go back to the beginning to the learning objectives and basically close the loop. I'll also show you chapter 2, only just to show you, for those who are involved in disciplines where there's a lot of mathematics, like economics. It's easy to write in the equations in LaTeX. And you can also do things like you can give them activities to do. So for example, here, Suzanne is giving an activity on how to have to do certain things in an Excel spreadsheet, and they actually can download the spreadsheet and work away on that. So are there any questions at this point before we move on? Or we're having questions at the end, I think, Thomas, is that correct?
I think we will have time for questions at the end.
Okay.
If we could just jump to chapter 6, John, and maybe we could show them some graphs that I've also done.
Yep.
So you can create and insert any kinds of graphs that you develop yourself, or little diagrams. And I've just made these in PowerPoint and inserted them as images. So I reuse those for my actual course materials as well. So I found that quite interesting, that I could, create my own graphs and insert them just like any other textbook would be in the commercial space. I think that's probably all I
yeah. So
have to say on that.
We might bring it back to you, Thomas.
Great. So what I might do now is reshare my screen, and Jane Johnston is now going to talk a little bit about her book, Public Interest Communication. I'm hoping everybody can see my screen.
Thanks, Thomas. Thomas, are you happy to drive the jumping into that book? Would you mind? It might just be simpler. Is that okay?
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for having me here today. And I'd like to congratulate John and Suzanne on an amazing book. And it's really great that theirs is economics and mine is humanities, because they're really quite different. And we've used a lot of different ideas, but obviously a lot of the same. I can't speak highly enough of the Pressbook interface. I love working in it. My experience as an academic is I got stuck into textbooks a long time ago, and I've written 8 textbooks with commercial publishers. I loved doing it, but I always found that the lag was an issue, and that interestingly didn't come up so much with the student feedback. But for me as an academic, writing in media and communication, I wanted everything to be really new and really fresh. And by the time it gets to print, some things are, have changed or are outdated or whatever. So I really loved this interface because we could change it as we went. I'd like to acknowledge my co-author, Robin Gulliver. I did the predominantly I was the writer of it was my concept. I started a course at UQ called Public Interest Communication the year before we published the book the beginning of last year. And there was no text because it's a new field that's been carved out. So it was a logical time to develop a textbook. I had written a couple of books and co-authored a couple of books that were academic, but they just weren't appropriate for a fairly deep conceptual topic for students. So this was a wonderful opportunity. I love being able to integrate incorporate what I teach, which is integrating media into practice, because I'm a communication and media scholar. So for me, the integration was absolutely fabulous in this book. So I'd like to jump straight into the book then. I suppose before I go to the features, which is my second point, my first point was really student response. The student response was fantastic. I love it. It's all of those things that Lara and Danny were saying, not least of which it's free, but they also loved the fact that it was available. The link to it was available on my Blackboard site, the school course Blackboard site, and it was just a click. And we were straight into it. And it meant that the tutors, irrespective of whether they taught the course before or not, could just dive straight into it as well. So it was really wonderfully intuitive. And I think students are much more intuitive in this space where they can click and find, as opposed to my other textbooks. I'm teaching from a print textbook this semester. This is a second semester book, and I'm not really looking forward to it. So let's go to the book, and I'd like to quickly point out some features. So this is what they look like when they're live. And if you look at download this book there on the right-hand side, if we can, Thomas would open that. See, it's available to be downloaded in various different versions, but predominantly we were using it live, so we didn't download it. Well, that's my experience with it anyway, because we were using it in class. So if you could just scroll down, please, Thomas, to chapter 4. There's two different ways you can read the book as well. The contents will pop up shortly. They're on the left-hand side, but they're also underneath. So if we go to chapter 4, I just wanted to identify a couple of things. First, we'll show you what it looks like. Our H5P, Robin did the majority of the interactivities, and I wrote the text because it was something that I was more familiar with. So we worked together on the interactivities, but she was the brainstorm for them because I'm not particularly good at the technical side of the space. So this is just an example. If you want to just press on those, these were just what we call discourse arenas, showing students examples. Obviously, all the images were taken from the Creative Commons of how public debate has been generated in different places, different countries, and different times. And then if we move down through chapter 4, please. Another major feature was this. If we stop there at podcast, one of the student assessments is to do a podcast, and they identify one of the United Nations sustainability goals. So that might be poverty in this case, and they have to localize it. Most of them localize it within the country they're working in, but we really wanted this to be available to all students because they're working in different countries, especially when this book first came out. We had as many students working online as we did at UQ in person, so they were coming from all over the place. These students were did their podcast based on Kenya. Can we press, what we've done now is we've embedded these podcasts throughout the book. Could we listen to just the first 45 seconds of that, Thomas?
Give it a go. So I'll press it now.
If it doesn't work, it's not the end of the world. We're not getting anything. That's fine. It begins with the Zoom isn't shared. Yeah, no, that's fine. We obviously got students' permission to use their podcasts, and the fact that they're being published in a book that's now being used at least in one university in the States and one in the UK they were pretty happy with that, as were we. So we updated that this year last year, when we ran the course for the second time, and it's now getting a bit podcast heavy, so we might have to move some of them on in time. But it was really exciting, and because we do a podcast, the students could see the podcast that other students had done. They were always looking for what other students have done, so we loved that. And then if we can please move, Thomas, to chapter 6. I'm not timing myself, so if I go too long, just tell me to stop. But I'll try and be quite quick. So we broke it in the book, as you can see there, into 2 parts. There was public interest theory and then public interest in action. So wicked problems we looked at in chapter 6. And I just wanted to identify a couple of other elements in the book, other features. As the previous text had shown, there were breakout boxes where we could insert, as that shows their wickedness. It's a quote, but you could also put definitions in those and so on and so forth. We tried to keep the book text light for obvious reasons, as I'm sure our previous presenters felt the same way. These are not light subjects, so you have to lighten them up, and it worked really well. So embedded videos, we've got videos embedded as with the previous book. These, of course, were all in the Creative Commons, and they illustrated. We don't need to go to it, but they illustrated the points that we were making. So we incorporated little breakout boxes like that, often with a video that illustrated the concepts we were speaking about previously, or we were writing about previously. The next feature, which we can probably find if we just scroll down, as you can see, deliberative democracy there is in bold. Sorry, just underneath. Yep. And that goes to a glossary. So we developed our own glossary. And then Walter Lippmann in the next, so that came up there, and you could also go to the glossary at the end. Walter Lippmann, who's in the next chapter, it was a link to a site on Walter Lippmann. So these are just elements that I wanted to kind of show, I suppose. There's the sustainability goals, and we used examples there that then led straight into the assessment for students to look at in their own backyards. So 6, that is, let's go to chapter 9. I just wanted to go to a couple of other examples. If I'm rushing too much, I apologise. I just wanted to show you a bit of breadth of the book. The chapter on capital and capacity building, more H5Ps. I didn't even know they were called that until I spoke to Thomas the other day. There's just a diagram which we use, but this H5P I'd like to show you because it's quite fun. So which of the following, sorry, go back to that one. Thomas, move back. Yeah, that's great. Thank you. Which of the following words apply to bridging social capital? And then these words come up, and within, you press, you get to put them all in, and then as with the one that Suzanne showed us, it tells you if it's correct or incorrect. Because in social capital, there's bridging or bonding, so they could add 50% chance of getting it right. These weren't really meant to be major Q&As. They're just meant to be a bit of fun. And we did these in the tutes as well, which was really a great tool. Actually, Bridge, we felt, we have a lot of international students, and because they're very, very straightforward and they weren't textually heavy, everyone kind of enjoyed joining in. The next thing in this chapter I just wanted to show you briefly was, if we move down to this, the picture of Australia, we used research that the University of Melbourne had done, which is called 50 Words, which is a study that they've done where they've identified Indigenous words and what they mean in different Indigenous languages. Could we press on that, please? It may or may not work, but if we could try it. I go to the University of Melbourne to get permission for this, which was unusual for the book. Most of what we used was in the Creative Commons, but we got permission to use this, and it's a great activity. Again, we embedded that into the tutorial exercises. So the students, we just worked through all of these words mean different things, and we just worked through in a tutorial exercise. It was a lot of fun. There is audio that comes with it as well. So we just played around with that. The students just loved being able to work with the textbook at the same time as we were doing it. As we, while it was happening live, it showcased research that's happening in other universities, all of those things which I guess showed how important the research teaching interface is in universities. If we could possibly go back to that chapter, I think that's the 9, yes, so 50 words. And then we embedded, if we go back to just go to the end of that chapter, please, at the end of that chapter, all of the chapters had Q&As at the end as well. So we've just jumped, I think they're either just jumped over or they come later. Creative Clunes was another one that was fun. Questions embedded from Q&A, questions there that were embedded that have got illustrations attached. But the Q&As really followed on from the chapters. The other things I wanted to point out, I think I've pointed out as we went, as I've gone. So the fact that there was a glossary, or the references could be hidden at the end, that was kind of nice. So that students could look up any references. We did have a reflective journal, a reflective summary for the students to undertake, not for the book, but for the course. Lots of references there. They didn't need to go too far. We got endorsements from both students and we took anonymously from CCATs from the previous year and several academics both from within University of Queensland and internationally. Sorry, checking that I've covered everything. I can't speak highly enough of working in this interface where we found, we trialed it. I'm sorry, my dog might bark in a minute. We trialed it in the first year. We uploaded it and we told the students it was still in a draft form. And we asked them if there was a typo. We said, we really want to know about it. And there were plenty. And we could just fix it like that. And, to this day, I love being able to go and say, oh, I like this other word better than that word. I don't do it so much anymore, but when I teach it next semester, I will update several of the case studies. The real time of this book is, I think, one of its absolutely amazing features over and above what the student feedback found. Very happy to answer any other questions. Thanks for listening today.
Thanks, Jane. So I will go back to the slides. We've got a couple of slides to, can I find them? That's the question. We've got a couple of slides to cover, and then we'll have some time for questions, if that sounds okay. So I guess I just wanted to finish off by talking a little bit about funding and support that's available for maybe academics who are thinking about beginning an open textbook. So the first thing that we want you to be aware of is that UQ has a grant program in place. And so you can see that our grant program has two streams. We've got a lower amount for those wishing to adapt an existing open textbook to use in their course. And then we've got a larger amount for those wishing to sort of create a new open textbook from scratch, where it might potentially replace a commercial textbook. So these funds can be used to cover any of the costs associated with producing the book. So this could include things like copy editing or video production, or to fund the development of H5P activities. And I guess the other important thing to note is this grant is available throughout the year. So we know now is probably a really busy time for everybody, but if you have heard what sort of Jane and Suzanne have had to say and you're interested at some point in the future, this grant will be available then. Additionally, we've got a second grant. So we've got some grants offered by the Council of Australian University Libraries. And you can see that these funding amounts range from $2,500 to $4,500. This is a sort of a limited, I guess, time in which to apply, but they'll probably be offered each year, okay? So at the moment, this grant program is currently open and they're seeking expressions of interest by the 24th of February. An interesting thing about this grant program is they're really trying to encourage collaboration between universities. Okay, so if you have a colleague in another university who's teaching in a similar area, this would be a really great grant program to sort of try and take an advantage of. All right. So I'll just finish on this slide to talk a little bit about the support that's available. So obviously, as you might have heard from John's segment, learning designers are a really great resource if you're thinking about creating an open textbook. So they can sort of have a discussion with you and help you sort of develop a book that matches your learning objectives. And they can also provide a lot of training and advice on incorporating those interactive components that Jane and Suzanne both mentioned were really important to the experience. Additionally, the library also offers a lot of support in this space. So we've got the Open Textbook at UQ program. So we'll post your book on our platform, Pressbooks, and we'll provide sort of ongoing training and technical support to authors throughout the content creation process. And as you get a little bit closer to publication too, we'll step in and we'll complete some copyright and accessibility reviews to make sure that the content is correct. And we'll also make sure that you have things like ISBNs, DOIs, and other sort of metadata so that your book is findable on the web and through our library catalog. Lastly, we'll set up a dashboard for you so you can measure how your book's being used. So it's important that a lot of work goes into these open textbooks, and it's important that, I guess, authors can prove that their books are being highly used. All right, so that brings us to the end of the session today. I hope everybody's found it interesting. We've got about 10 minutes, I think, for questions. So what I might do is I'm happy if you'd like to raise your hand or just speak up, and I'll also see what questions are in the chat that I can ask.
Thomas, we had one for Jane specifically about whether Jane, do you get much interest outside of UQ? Your book?
The short answer is I haven't really actively checked. I had interest with, as I said, one uni in the US and one in the UK. And because we've only run it as live, so the first running of it was last year, 2021, but it was only available to the UQ students because it was the draft. So then it was published last year. I think it's very early to try and figure that out, although I probably should jump in and find out. So the short answer is I'm not sure. It's not a mainstream PR or comms course, public interest communication. It's kind of quite bespoke. So I suspect that the interest will be possibly quite bespoke, but the beauty of it is that we have had interest in, now that I think about it, just in, for example, the chapter on wicked problems. So you don't have to buy the whole textbook to get the chapter, which we can do in the library through the library with any book, but that's been good feedback. I will follow up this year to see how many other people are using it, but I think it's pretty early days yet to know how widely it is. I have found it's taken a while for people to find it, to be honest. So I'd be very interested to follow up with Thomas about the findability of it, because that's not feedback that I'm getting from people. And it's probably because it's quite new.
Could I possibly add to that? Sorry, I'm hijacking your question, Jane. Thomas, if you could unshare your screen, maybe I can share my analytics with everyone.
Yeah, just give me a moment.
And to kind of capture the other side, because I've been actively tracking mine. So there's two ways I can measure the impact of my book. You can measure the impact via the analytics inside the Pressbook platform itself. And it tells you within a certain range that you can change the number of hits that you have, each month or each day. And we also, Thomas has put together these Google dashboards, which show you kind of like the international impact and where the visitors are coming from. So I can see currently, I'm not teaching from it, but I'm getting a lot of clicks from the United States currently in terms of people who are actively accessing my my book outside of obviously my course, because those aren't my students. So I can change these date ranges and whatnot to actually get the full number of page views, the number of users, all of that information. I think overall I've had about 30,000 different people view the book at various components of the book over time. But that information is there and it is collectible. So you can kind of really see, who is actually viewing what you've created, which I really love. So I'll stop sharing that now.
Sorry, yeah, we'll get to your question soon, Francisco, but while we're on the topic, Peter had a question about, is the textbook only available to UQ students? And would other libraries have to, other libraries or students have to pay?
It's freely available to everyone or anyone. So yeah, definitely that's a big part of what open textbooks are. So we don't want to kind of try and restrict them. There are certain circumstances where maybe a Pressbook author wants to trial the book just within a small cohort, and we can definitely do that. So I see Jane nodding.
I was just going to say, as I mentioned before, we trialed the draft in the closed environment of the class for the first time, and that was fabulous because otherwise it would have been awkward because it was a draft. We would have had to wait another year, but because we could trial it within UQ, it worked very well, and then we went open in the second offering last year.
Excellent, thank you. Alyssa just made a comment about how they could be used for evidence of impact. But Francesco, I think you had your hand up.
Yeah, thank you. So I have two questions for Suzanne. First, how much easier is it to coordinate a course after you have the book ready with the material? And the second one, it's more in the interest of courses that I tutor. Do you know if it's possible to use coding, and in particular R, in the book, as we can use in Edge discussion boards, for example? Those are the two questions.
So first one, I actually really like that I've created my own book that supports my course, in particular in a specialist area such as cost-benefit analysis. Most of the existing textbooks are American textbooks, which don't have relevant examples for what we do. So when I created my content, I was trying to draw as much from Australian public policy as possible, and create the book in a perspective that we are in Australia and we're going to be implementing these projects in Australia. And given the design, I kind of started with the process of what do I teach each week, and then how can I actually create that into weekly chapters. So that kind of created my book in that sense. That's why there's exactly 13 chapters, because I have 13 weeks in a semester. And the answer to the second question about R, I'm not sure. I know that you can definitely put in LaTeX in terms of your beautiful, beautiful equation editor for people who do a lot of math, but I've not actually actively sought out whether R coding can be done.
Perfect, thank you.
There's also a question from Jacqueline about the workload involved, particularly as there won't be royalties, etc. Would one of you like to speak to that at all?
I'm happy to speak to it, and maybe Suzanne and John too, but I'll be brief. I shared the workload like they did. There were two of us. As I said, I've written many other texts. It was definitely nowhere near as hard. It was shorter. It was funner. And I did get the $3,000 startup, which was actually what I used to bring Robin on as an RA, and then realized because she was an upcoming new career researcher that it would work in her favor to have a co-authorship. So I broached that with her. So she actually, and I got permission, made sure that was okay with the funders, that she came on as an RA. That's where the $3,000 was spent, and then she co-authored it, which obviously was going to take more time than $3,000 worth of work. We did it in a year. We did the first draft in a year, and then we spent about 6 months polishing it. So that, I think that question was probably asked as well. That's about a year shorter than most other texts that I've written.
Right, so I might share my experience. I committed to the project, I think, in March 2021, and I received the $3,000 grant as well. But I didn't actually actively start working probably until November that year to roll out in February 2022. So my time frame was much shorter, but I had already in my mind exactly what I wanted to do. I was taking what was my lecture slide material and converting that into a space where students can read in more detail about various concepts. So I think I had a better starting point. I wasn't starting from scratch in that sense. The funding I did have from the library grants was used to have someone support me write some of those H5P activities. And that was, I think, a critical use of that money. I needed obviously additional help to make sure that the activities weren't as repetitive, being the only person writing them. And the tutor that helped me with that also did a bit of proofreading. At the same time, I'm well aware there's probably spelling mistakes in mine and small typos here and there. I actually give out coffee vouchers to my students who find those. That's one of my strategies for ironing out those little blips. So if they find a mistake, they could email me and they get a coffee voucher. I've only spent about, I think, $55 at this point on coffee vouchers, and I've been running from this textbook for a year now. So this will be my 3rd semester with it this coming semester.
Alyssa, you had a question about academics who don't feel like they don't have the skills.
Yeah. What would the people who've authored these types of books now say for an academic who might be balking at starting this? Because it sounds great, you get a little bit of money, but everyone goes, oh my gosh, you know, thanks, but I don't know what to do with this and where to start, and maybe I just don't have the skill set to do this.
I guess my response is, because it's an organic document, it doesn't have to start big. I'd say, you know, we've all written journal articles, we've all written chapters, PhDs, there's a lot of chapters in those. I think everyone's got one of these in them. I mean, I am a journalist by trade, so I write at this level quite well, quite easily. It's sort of just my kind of second nature. You write for 12-year-olds. And mine is a simple book. But I think with what we do on Blackboard and what we've done with our academic work, if we kind of merge those together, it's really not that hard. You could, as I said, you could have a draft up of 3 or 4 chapters and trial it with your class. And I actually think the students really like that engagement, and then build from there, so that you mightn't publish it openly for a year. I'm not sure what Thomas's response to that would be, but I just don't think that you have to commit to the 12, 13, 14, 15 chapters. That's a lot. Ours is 10, and it's absolutely adequate.
One thing that I might say is my starting point was just to open a Word document and start writing my thoughts into the Word document. Given that mine was more of a traditional textbook approach, I was thinking about what do I want my students to learn each week? What are the critical components? And so I would just scaffold out, you know, headings, and then put dot points under the headings and then flesh it out from there.
I should add something. So with the grant program, we do sort of encourage the book to be completed within a year. But of course, we know everybody's really busy. And so, you know, we're very happy to be flexible and try and work with you to kind of roll your book out as easily as possible as well. So.
I know we're almost out of time, but I think we may have missed a question from Kelly Ashley. Other than student works, have there been chapters in open textbooks authored overseas or in Australia that have been suitable for reuse and inclusion in a UQ production?
I haven't got student chapters, and I'd be loath to do that. I'm happy to include students' works, and it's worked really well with the podcasts, and to get their input, examples, talk about examples in the tutorial and integrate them in any updates. to me, that interactivity with the students is part of the benefit of it. But I wouldn't be incorporating chapters written by students. I think for me, maybe it's not a control thing, it's just not where my head is.
I think it was more about works written from overseas, whether
I could
more about
definitely-
reusing other people's
Yeah, I have a
content.
colleague. I have a colleague at University of Florida that I've met through this, and I'm sure I could ask her to write a chapter. It'd have, but of course, it would have to be copyright free. Not everybody's into that. But yeah, I mean, I'd be really interested in incorporating, say, an additional chapter that was an invited international expert. Do it that way.
Just on that, I often linked out to other resources, but didn't necessarily incorporate it into mine. So there might have been something existing on Pressbook, like important microeconomic concept that I don't want to have to revisit for my students, but I would link out to a resource that's also on the Pressbook platform at another institution as a, FYI, go and have a look at this before doing the next section kind of thing. But that would probably be as far as I went down that.
Pressbooks does have a facility where you can clone other Pressbooks. So it does make it really pretty easy to kind of reuse or adapt overseas books that are also have the appropriate license. So it's definitely something we've seen. So if you find something, we're happy to sort of have a conversation with you if you're interested in sort of adapting a book. Sorry, Chris, I might have cut you off there.
No, that's great. Thank you. And I guess that's a benefit of the platform. Just as Suzanne was saying, being able to link to external resources, because I believe that there's even some copyright issues around linking to some things. Is that right, Thomas?
There can be, yeah. So if it's pirated content, for instance, that would be problematic. So yeah, definitely some issues. But we've got a copyright officer at the university, and who can really help answer all of the sort of questions you might have when you're kind of creating your open textbook.
The copyright officer was very helpful in my case about what I could and couldn't do, particularly given the kind of diagrams I was creating for economics.
Yeah, he's great, awesome. So I can't recommend him enough.
So I think we're almost out of time. Thomas, would you like to wrap it up?
Yeah, well, thank you very much to all of our speakers. It's been really interesting to kind of hear your different experiences with open textbooks. And thank you very much for everybody who's attended today to learn more about open textbooks. If you are interested in pursuing a project down the line, we would love to hear from you. So please don't be shy about getting in touch with us. And we put some links to some of our sort of grant application pages in the chat as well. So thank you, everyone. I might end the session now if that's okay.